The objective of this video is to analyze from a wide, though general perspective, the living state migrants have to pass through on their journey in the search to a safer place with more opportunities for them to maintain the social and economic security of their families than their former dwelling place could not. Also, we look into the misconceptions around them and the situations they should front even before they get accepted into their final destination. To get started, a refugee is a person that is forced to flee her or his country from a conflict or persecution in order to find safety and a better quality of life.
During 2015, the most seriously refugees crisis occurred in Europe since World War II, a crisis that is publicly materialized in the unexpected growth in the number of migrants and especially refugees coming mainly from Syria, but also from Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Somalia, among other countries who thought vulnerable and dangerous routes trying to reach the European territory. In 2015, around 1,257,000 Terry news applications for international protection were rejected. This situation has created an authentic crisis of migration governance in Europe, to the point that there are institutions such as the International Organization for Migration (IOM) that speaks more of a crisis of European policies and European asylum system than of a crisis of immigrants and refugees. In recent years, this flow of forced migration has increased dramatically due to a number of reasons. Most notable, the civil war in Syria. The conflict in Syria began in 2010, when the opposition to the Bashar al-Assad regime called for democratic reforms and the possibility of holding democratic elections during 2010. The protests quickly led to a regime crisis, which was feels opposed to any kind of change, and finally in a scenario of increasing instability, where different groups and factions fought each other for the control of the Syrian state, a conflict that finally led to a bloody civil war, which progressively affected the country. This conflict scenario caused a growing flow of displaced population, both inside and outside the country, to the point that in short time Syria became the country with the most larger of numbers of refugees and internally displaced people in the world, a population that has fled war, conflict, and violence in search of a better, safer life abroad.
The journey of refugees starts in their home country, where they are forced to leave it due to conflict, human rights violation, persecution, and poverty. Then they have to decide the destiny country and how they can get there through sea or land. In the case of the refugee crisis, they could choose between crossing the Balkans or crossing the Mediterranean. Both options have their own risk. According to the UNHCR, between the years 2015 to 2018, there were approximately 14,281 deaths by sea and 427 deaths recorded along their land routes at Europe's border. If they decided to go by land, it was less risky, but the chances of getting caught were higher. In both cases, most of the refugees decided to pay between $1,000 up to $6,000 approximately to get a smuggler that helped them cross, and it was not a guarantee that they were going to make it. A problem that came across was that by 2016, different European countries such as Hungary, Macedonia, Croatia, and Slovenia decided to cross their borders due to the big demand of refugees. This was an unfavorable situation because the refugees had to stay in camps or in tents in the borders waiting for asylum responses that took between 3 months or even years due to the bad system and high demands. Besides, the conditions in which refugees live were horrible and they couldn't do anything. They just had to wait for someone else to decide the future of their lives. Then, if they got asylum, most of them suffered from cultural shock and discrimination from the people in the country. Nujin Mustafa, a Syrian refugee, said in a TED Talk the following: "Believe me, a few things in this world are worse than feeling like an unwelcome guest."
As of 2018, most refugees in Europe come from either the Middle East or Northern and Central Africa. In the case of the Middle East, the ongoing wars and dispute for power between different groups of the region has affected the livelihood of millions of people. Out of all Middle East countries, Syria and Afghanistan are the ones that have generated the higher number of refugees. In the case of Syria alone, the constant conflict and civil wars sparked by different rebel and extremist groups in the region have displaced as much as 6.65 million people between 2012 and 2018. On the other hand, with a history of constant wars, intervention and occupation, a total of 2.6 million people from 1979 to 2018 have been forced to escape from Afghanistan. In the case of Africa, a mix of political and economical instability in the region have also generated millions of refugees. In the region, we can highlight the cases of Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, and Central African Republic, countries where there has been an influx of refugees during the last decade. Well, refugees are ultimately an innocent group of people. They are not at fault for what conflicts or crises exist in the world. Refugees do not choose to flee their country, they see themselves forced to leave. And it is not a pleasant experience for them to leave everything behind and have to start from scratch somewhere else. We as humans should sympathize with this kind of people and help them preserve their basic rights and help them resume their life in the best way possible. Besides, integrating people from different cultures and backgrounds has shown with different studies to be beneficial.
One aspect of the situation with the refugees is to what extent they have an impact in a country's economy or way of living. When a country becomes a host to refugees, first they immediately require accommodation, housing, and access to basic human services such as healthcare and education. This alone presents itself as an economic challenge to developing countries who are also acting as host countries. Later on, it is required for these refugees to provide for their own livelihood and start to interact economically with the country they are now living in. Contrary to what is normally believed, refugees have more positive impacts in a country rather than negatives. To mention a few, they serve as a stimulus to the local economy through their demand of products, which translates to higher output prices, the need for more local workers, and higher incomes for the already established people of the country. Another benefit of the embracing of refugees in a community is that the economic integration of these groups also helps to diminish the socio-cultural clashes that may exist because of the misconceptions that people have of this community. And those are only some of the positive consequences, because later on, when they have completely established inside the countries, it is known that they represent a good percentage of new companies that create more jobs for refugees or local people and also provide for the economy. After mentioning this, we are aware that the presence of refugees also has a shock on the economy. Studies have shown that the prices of goods in the area in which they are living may suffer from unexpected changes, which is good for some people but not so much for other groups. Studies show that in many cases the concern of residents of host countries relate to security rather than possible economic effects. These concerns in the subject of security is born because of all the misinformation and prejudice surrounding the culture of most of the refugees. It also has an impact on the issue, the size of the displaced population and the distribution of the refugees. This is an issue that no matter where you are in the world, you can help and make it disappear by spreading the right information and trying to inform those around you to contribute to make the life of the refugees, once accepted into a community, easier.
We completely defend the idea that refugees should not have to pass such a hard time finding a host country. However, although each member country of the European Union must comply with the imposed asylum law, they also end up deciding according to internal interests, and many times the theory of how the processes should work differs from the practice. For this reason, we conclude that an exhaustive research must be carried out, which takes into account the different variables in the decision to grant asylum and protection to any refugee. We also believe that social awareness programs should be more frequent, by understanding the causes that lead the natives of the receiving countries to discriminate and segregate groups and developing strategies that prove wrong the misconceptions and stereotypes of refugees in that geographical area. Thus, much more solid policies can be established that truly seek to provide comprehensive protection and well-being, ideally to all refugees who require it, receiving the host countries at the same time internal benefits in the short and long term.